The Soviet Union has admitted that an accident has taken place at a nuclear power station at Chernobyl in the Ukraine. But as usual, when disasters occur, the Soviet authorities have released very little information. The news agency TASS issued a report in which it spoke of casualties, but without saying how many there were or how great was the destruction caused. TASS said one of the station's reactors was damaged in the accident, that measures were being taken to eliminate the consequences, and that aid was being sent to the injured. Our Moscow correspondent, Peter Ruff, has been studying what little information the Russians have made available.
There seems little doubt that the speedy announcement of the accident came because other countries, Sweden, Finland and Norway, detected high discharges of radioactivity in the air. It was Sweden which first reported the concern to the Soviet authorities through its embassy in Moscow. They were told that no accident had been reported to the nuclear energy authorities here, but that they would be kept informed. It's clear now that this was an accident that the Soviet Union knew it could not keep quiet. Most of the TASS report was devoted to highlighting nuclear accidents elsewhere in the world. It quoted figures for the United States where it said there were 2,300 accidents, breakdowns or faults registered in 1979 alone. This accident, said TASS, was the first at a Soviet nuclear power station. It has been reported but never confirmed that there was huge contamination near Sverdlovsk in the Urals in 1958, which killed hundreds of people and forced the permanent evacuation of thousands of others over a 50-square-mile area. But that was at a nuclear waste facility, not a power plant.
Now, for an assessment of the implications of the accident, here's our science correspondent, Clive Cookson.
From the meagre details released by the Soviet authorities, this seems to have been the most serious reactor accident in the history of nuclear power. It was certainly worse than 3 Mile Island, which released relatively little radioactivity. The Chernobyl power station is several times larger than any nuclear plant in Britain. It has 4 reactors, of a type known technically as light water-cooled graphite moderated, which is hardly used outside the Soviet Union. The radiation levels detected in Scandinavia today suggest that the core of one of the reactors melted and released intense radioactivity, perhaps because its cooling water leaked away. By the time the fallout reached Sweden, 1,000 miles away, it was still more than twice the natural level of radioactivity in the atmosphere. But radiation experts say there is no risk to anyone's health outside the Soviet Union.
Despite mounting concern in Scandinavia and the rest of Europe, the Russians have given no further details of what seems certain to have been the major accident at their Chernobyl nuclear plant in the Ukraine. Radiation levels in Scandinavia are still well above normal, in parts of eastern Sweden and Finland up to 100 times worse than normal following showers of rain. But still, the Russians have refused to say what has happened at Chernobyl or even when it happened. One clue came from Sweden this morning, when the local atomic authority is thought to have been approached by the Russians for advice on how to fight a fire in a nuclear plant. This has led to speculation that the reactor core at Chernobyl may still be on fire, and if this is so, there could be further risks of radioactive pollution. The Swedes have told the Russians that they've no practical experience of fighting such fires, and are said to have referred the Soviet officials to the British Atomic Energy Authority, which had to put out a fire at wind scale in the 1950s. Further confirmation of this possible development came a few minutes ago when it was reported from Bonn that the Russians were seeking West German advice on how to fight a fire at a nuclear installation. But there's been no word on any of this from Moscow. However, as our correspondent in the Soviet capital, Peter Ruff, reports, evidence reaching that city suggests that there's been a major disaster.
From what we can glean from a few telephone conversations with people in Kiev, life seems to be going on as normal. There are unconfirmed reports that people living near the power plant 50 miles away are being evacuated by bus. An American who's with a party of more than 70 British and US students on a 3-month exchange visit there said there was no obvious sign that anything is seriously wrong. They went to classes as normal, and Soviet officials were only able to tell them what the brief Soviet news agency report said yesterday. Local radio stations do not appear to be making any special announcements. There's been no contact yet with the site of the accident, and since it's a top-secret nuclear installation, there probably won't be. Here in Moscow, the Soviet Foreign Ministry is finding itself under increasing diplomatic pressure to disclose more about the accident, which everyone seems to agree must be a serious one.
The accident at Chernobyl has led to increased radiation levels throughout Scandinavia, and the governments of Sweden, Denmark and Norway are formulating an official protest over the way the Soviet authorities have handled the issue. It's thought the accident may have happened on Saturday, but yesterday morning the Russians were still denying that anything was wrong. This report from Julian Isherwood in Copenhagen.
The Institutes of Radiation Hygiene in both the Danish and Norwegian capitals are still measuring increased levels of radiation more than 72 hours after the accident at Chernobyl is thought to have taken place. Both institutes say that their measurements show neither a rise nor fall in the amount of iodine, cesium and cobalt pollution which has been brought to Scandinavia on the prevailing southeasterly winds. Although Swedish measurements suggest that there has been a fall in their isotope counts, this, the institutes say, is due to the fact that while Sweden and Finland received the full brunt of the pollution, Denmark and Norway are on the periphery. It takes longer for a fall to be registered there, they say. According to nuclear scientists throughout the region, there's no danger to the populations in any of the 4 Nordic countries, despite levels of radiation 5 times the normal. Nonetheless, there's not an iodine tablet to be found in Oslo or Copenhagen. Within a few hours of the announcement that unusual levels of radioactivity had been detected, queues started forming at chemists. The tablets prevent the thyroid gland from absorbing radioactive iodine, one of the isotopes discovered in the air after the accident.
Scientists at Britain's National Radiological Protection Board, based at Harwell in Oxfordshire, say that measurements they've been taking this morning confirm that no radiation from the Soviet leak has reached this country. A spokesman for the Weather Centre in London said the prevailing winds are likely to continue to carry any radioactivity away from Britain.
It became clear during today that the Chernobyl nuclear accident is far from over. The Russians have asked Swedish and West German experts for help in coping with what they themselves are now calling a disaster. And there are reports of a mass evacuation of an area north of Kiev around the stricken nuclear plant, though there has been no official confirmation of this. The latest developments suggest that the graphite moderator, which controls the nuclear reactor, has caught fire, and the Russians are having great trouble putting out the flames. This may be because the intense radioactivity is preventing the Soviet firefighters getting close enough to smother the fire with carbon dioxide or water. The nuclear fuel rods in the reactor are surrounded with graphite, a pure form of carbon like coal, and the heat of the burning graphite is presumably driving off more radioactive gases from the metal fuel rods, which must have melted by now. Britain experienced a similar graphite fire in the 1957 Windscale accident, and the UK Atomic Energy Authority is probably better placed than any other in the world to advise the Soviet authorities, but it has not yet been asked for help. This afternoon, Radio Moscow's English language service described the accident for the first time as a disaster.
The disaster was the first one at Soviet nuclear power plants in more than 30 years. The use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes is a vital necessity for humanity because of the gradual exhaustion of conventional fuels. Drastic measures are being carried out to guarantee the power reactor's reliability and safety. Nevertheless, our observer notes, as this accident and many others at nuclear power facilities in Western countries show that the application of nuclear power, even for peaceful purposes, can be dangerous.
Later, Radio Moscow withdrew the word disaster, speaking of an error in translation. The Soviet authorities are still giving away very little about the accident to their own citizens, as Peter Ruff reports from Moscow.
I understand the Soviet government may break its silence by running an authorized report on its main television news bulletin, which has just gone on the air. But it's clear that they're dealing with a major accident, and the fire in the core of the 1,000-megawatt light water reactor is still not under control. During the day, fears for the safety of people in the 2 main cities closest to the accident, Kiev and Minsk, have faded. People in both places report that life is going on as normal. But there are unconfirmed reports that an evacuation was ordered covering the 30-mile radius of the plant itself. Buses and lorries from Kiev may have been used to ferry people away. One source of anxiety is the effect the radiation may have on a huge local reservoir close to the plant. Here in Moscow, Soviet people are expressing puzzlement and concern. All they've been told on television and radio is that the reactor is damaged and that there are casualties. Facts which were not even mentioned in the morning newspapers although the evening paper Izvestia reproduced the one-paragraph announcement issued by the Council of Ministers 24 hours earlier.
It became clear that the reactor was still burning when the Russians appealed informally for assistance this morning from Sweden and West Germany. The Swedes referred the Russians to Britain. The Germans said they were ready to help, as Diana Goodman reports from Bonn.
The first request from the Soviet Union to West Germany came at 8 o'clock this morning when staff at the Atomic Forum, a centre run by the German atomic energy industry, turned up for work. There, waiting to see them, were two officials from the Soviet embassy who said they'd been sent to ask for help. The Forum's Secretary General, Dr. Thomas Rosa, says he understood that the graphite fire was still burning and that radiation was still being released in what he described as the worst possible disaster in the type of nuclear plant involved. Experts all over West Germany have now been contacted for advice, and the Soviet ambassador in Bonn has also had a meeting at the Foreign Ministry. But the government says that at this stage no formal request for assistance has been made. If it is, there's no doubt that it will be provided. Chancellor Kohl, who's away in India, has been keeping in touch with Bonn for news of the disaster and has said that West Germany will supply any help it can. But experts here are also highly critical of the Soviet Union for being unable to get the fire under control. They say they're astonished that the possibility of such an accident was apparently never anticipated.
The first intimation of a nuclear disaster came from the Scandinavians at the weekend, when they detected rising levels of radioactivity in the atmosphere. Scandinavian scientists are continuing to monitor the situation, and they say that the level of radioactivity is no longer increasing. However, there's said to be a growing sense of outrage in all the Scandinavian countries about the way in which the Soviet Union has handled the crisis, and in particular about the fact that it took the Russians so long to tell anyone what was going on. Our correspondent in Copenhagen, Julian Isherwood, reports on the anger among the people of the region.
Particularly incensed that the Soviet government at first denied any accidents when asked on Monday morning, and it took 8 hours for a confirmation to come through. The Danish Prime Minister, Poul Schlüter, termed the delay indefensible, and environment ministers in Denmark, Sweden and Norway now say they intend to make an official protest demanding a full report on the extent of the accident. They say that it's only on the basis of such a report that it can be determined how long the Scandinavian countries will be subjected to increased radiation and whether a new upsurge in radiation count can be expected in the next few days. For the moment, though, the pollution does now seem to be receding.
The foreign country most directly affected by the accident is Poland, whose eastern border is some 300 miles from Chernobyl. The Polish authorities have established a special commission to report on the effects of the disaster, and they've announced officially that a radioactive cloud did pass over northeast Poland. Although it's being emphasized that there's no danger to public health, the Polish government spokesman left many questions unanswered when he gave a news conference in Warsaw today. Among the reporters there was our correspondent, Kevin Ruane.
The Government Commission met this morning and was due to meet again later today. In the meantime, the government spokesman, Mr. Jerzy Orban, assured his news conference that nearly 200 extra stations set up to monitor the environment had found no threat to public health. Radioactivity had gone up, especially in the northeast, he said, but the situation was not getting worse, it was tending to improve. There was, however, a state of readiness as regards medicines, food controls and food production. The government, understandably, is anxious not to encourage panic reactions, but the spokesman's failure to answer key questions could cast doubt on his message of reassurance. Mr. Orban could not say when or how Poland learned about the accident in the Ukraine. He could not give any figure for the increased radioactivity recorded in Poland. He could say nothing about the nature of the accident, despite the fact that the Polish and Soviet authorities, as he put it, have been and are in direct contact. The impression is that Poland will say nothing until the Soviet Union says it first. But another news conference has been promised soon.
At Westminster, MPs have expressed concern about the lack of information being released by the Soviet authorities and about any implications the accident might have for the British nuclear industry. Both the Prime Minister and the Environment Secretary, Mr. Kenneth Baker, were questioned in the Commons, as our political correspondent Kent Barker reports.
Mrs. Thatcher told MPs that the government had not received any request from the Soviet Union for advice or assistance. But this, she said, was not surprising under the circumstances, particularly in view of the way news of the accident had come to light.
I understand that the Swedish and Finnish governments were only informed of the accident after radioactive clouds had reached their territory. It is, of course, a duty upon an authority which belongs to the International Atomic Agency authority to report accidents to that authority.
Both the Prime Minister and the Environment Secretary, Mr. Kenneth Baker, said that monitoring in Britain had not detected any increase in the levels of radioactivity. They stressed the high standards of safety at United Kingdom nuclear power stations. In answer to questions from both sides of the House, the Prime Minister said that no decision about the proposed pressurised water reactor at Sizewell would be taken until after studying the report from the recent inquiry. Mr. Baker confirmed that the Soviet reactor was different to those used in British nuclear installations.
The design of the Russian reactor, which is a light water-cooled graphite moderated reactor, it is a unique design, and there are no other stations like it in the West, and I understand from the CEGB that British experts have evaluated this design and rejected it as unstable.
Mr. Baker told MPs that Britain would be making the strongest representations to the Soviet Union for full details of the accident.
Soviet television news is now on the air, and if there are any further developments, we'll bring them to you later in the bulletin.
That special report was compiled by our science correspondent, Clive Cookson.
2 days after the world first became aware of a nuclear disaster in the Ukraine, the Soviet authorities are still releasing only the minimum of information. They've admitted that 2 people were killed, but unofficially there's speculation that several hundred may have died. The British Embassy in Moscow has said that British students in Kiev and Minsk, the 2 cities nearest the power station at Chernobyl, will be leaving as soon as possible. And this morning the British Council said 31 of them would fly home tomorrow. But as Peter Ruff reports from Moscow, the Soviet authorities are still playing down the scale of the disaster.
Soviet government officials now seem to be moving swiftly to reassure foreign governments that the radiation danger from the accident is not widespread. The British Embassy and others have been told that the contamination is affecting a limited area north, south and west of the plant. And that seemed to be confirmed by a government spokesman in West Germany who said that the new Soviet ambassador there, Yulik Vitinsky, had given them the same information. But the Soviet government does not seem prepared to go much further than that, and the assumption must be that they are still dealing with the reactor. We understand there's a security zone with a radius of about 30 miles around the accident site. The Soviet media is not deviating from the government statement last night, which announced that 2 people were dead and medical assistance being given to an unspecified number of others. There are no public announcements in the Ukraine Republic giving warnings of radioactive contamination. The British Embassy here says the advice to Britons is not to visit any areas in the western sector of the Soviet Union for the time being. And British students and teachers in Kiev and Minsk who are anxious to leave are being booked on trains which will get them into Moscow early tomorrow morning.
Several European countries are continuing to report higher than normal levels of radiation. People in central and northeast Sweden are being advised not to drink rainwater. Finland has already issued similar advice. And there's growing concern in Poland, where the authorities have restricted sales of milk. There are also plans for children in Warsaw and northeastern Poland to be given doses of iodine to counteract the effects of radioactivity. Reporting from Warsaw, Kevin Ruane.
From this morning, children in Warsaw were supposed to be given single doses of a liquid iodine preparation in schools and health service clinics. But it proved difficult to find evidence that this had actually started. Huge queues formed at clinics, but families were told in some cases that none of the required preparation was available or that nothing was known of the plan. In some parts of the capital, meanwhile, people formed long queues at shops to stock up on powdered milk, butter and other foods produced before the accident in the Ukraine. Warsaw looked perfectly normal this morning, still enjoying a heat wave, but concern is obviously great, and the foreign community is equally at a loss to know what to do. The British and American embassies have been repeating to inquirers the advice already announced publicly by the Polish authorities. The British Embassy has prepared a bulletin advising British parents to wash their children's clothes and hair every day. But further advice from the Polish authorities will definitely be sought.
Small amounts of fallout from the nuclear power station accident in the Soviet Union have been detected over southeast England. A spokesman for the National Radiological Protection Board, which is monitoring the situation, has stressed that there will be no danger to health. Meanwhile, the Foreign Office has issued new advice to British travellers to Eastern Europe. is still advising people against going to Kiev, the western Ukraine, Minsk, Byelorussia and Lithuania, unless absolutely necessary, but is now thought safe to visit Leningrad, Moscow and the east of the Soviet Union. For a report on the radiation reaching this country, here's Roger Currell.
The first signs that the radioactive cloud had reached Britain were detected last night, and so far radioactive readings have been taken by scientists in Kent, Berkshire, Oxfordshire and Dorset. The monitoring is being supervised by the National Radiological Protection Board, and I asked the board's director, Mr. John Dunster, how concentrated were the samples they'd taken.
They are really very dilute. They're quite hard to measure. They represent something which is at least 1,000 times lower than would be permissible over the whole year for members of the public, as far as we've got so far.
So what risk do British people face then from them?
In simple terms, none at all, because the levels are really so low. We're only talking about the equivalent of very small extra periods of natural background. There really is, in any sensible meaning of the word, no risk.
But these are only the first parts of the remnants to come over Britain. Are we going to get more, and is it going to get worse?
We don't know how long it'll go on for. I don't see any reason to believe it'll get much worse. It may just continue at the same level, and it could continue for some days.
Mr. Dunster says the cloud could move across the Midlands and the north of England, although this depends on the direction of the wind. He says there's no need for anyone to take any precautions, not even farmers, but the Ministry of Agriculture will be testing milk and grass samples as a precaution anyway. Meanwhile, the board is still checking some of the belongings of the 100 British students who returned from the Soviet Union last night. Although they were given a health clearance, some of their luggage was found to be contaminated. British Airways says another 15 students are due to arrive back from Moscow this evening. The Department of Health says anyone returning from Eastern Europe who's worried should contact the police, who can direct them to hospitals which have the facilities to check for radiation. Meanwhile, about 100 Britons who were due to fly out to Russia with Thomson Holidays during the next week have had their holidays cancelled. But Intourist, the main Russian holiday agent here, is continuing with its programme.
Figures issued by the Civil Defence Committee in Guernsey show that radiation levels there are 11 times the normal and 22 times the normal for Alderney. But the committee says there's no cause for alarm and the levels aren't considered dangerous. Scientists in Holland, Belgium and West Germany say there have been slight increases in atmospheric radioactivity, but the levels aren't serious. The West German authorities are restricting supplies of fresh milk from some parts of the country. They say the milk won't be released for sale unless concentrations of iodine fall. In Sweden, the Radiation Board has advised farmers not to put their cows out to graze for another fortnight. The British Embassy in Moscow is advising British citizens there to wash fresh vegetables and peel fruit until there's a clear picture of where the radiation from the accident has spread. All Western embassies in Moscow have been testing for any sign of an increase in radioactivity. So far, they've found none. There's been no Soviet government statement today on the situation at the Chernobyl plant. However, Swedish scientists who've been studying satellite pictures say the fire may be under control, although they're not certain that radiation leaks have been stopped. The American surgeon, Dr. Robert Gale, is due to arrive in Moscow this evening. As an expert in bone marrow transplants, he's expected to give advice to surgeons dealing with the victims of radiation.
New information has come to light in the Soviet Union about the way the authorities in Chernobyl handled the evacuation of the area after the disaster at the nuclear power station. It seems that about 30,000 people were left in the Ukrainian town, some 12 miles from the stricken reactor, until last weekend. In effect, the majority of the people in the town weren't moved away until a week after the accident. The details have come from a Western diplomat in Moscow who has access to intelligence material. Our Moscow correspondent, Peter Ruff, reports.
This information probably comes from satellite surveillance. The diplomat says it was not until Saturday the 3rd and 4th of May, that's last weekend, that the bulk of the population left the town in buses and lorries. It was not completely cleared until 2 days ago. It's another piece of evidence which suggests that the Soviet authorities were slow to respond to the radiation danger and the possible contamination from the plant. They have revealed that an evacuation was carried out near the reactor on the day of the explosion. 24 hours later, several thousand more were ordered to move out of their homes. But it now appears that for an entire week, the population of one of the biggest towns in the area was not cleared. The same diplomatic source also says that the first sign of a problem with reactor number 4 at the plant probably came during the day of Friday, April the 25th. A power failure probably shut down the cooling unit, and there was a build-up of gas which exploded in the early hours of Saturday morning. The diplomat said it was beneath contempt for the Soviet authorities to have acted as they did. It had been a dirty trick, he said, against their own population and the rest of the world. Because they did not take advice from international experts earlier, they now have a hell of a problem.
The Soviet travel company, Intourist, says radiation leaks have now been eliminated at the Chernobyl plant. It says the reactor has been protected with more than 4,000 tons of sand, clay, limestone and lead. Intourist says stories about the accident are being used to inflame distrust of the Soviet Union. Hungary's leading foreign policy spokesman, Mr. Matyas Shuros, has called for more openness between governments in discussing accidents at nuclear power plants as well as nuclear weapons tests. He said people's fears about the effects on the environment must be taken into account. This report by Julian Saw in Vienna.
What Mr. Shuros is urging is what he calls honest and open dialogue in a world increasingly influenced by technological advances. In a speech broadcast by Budapest Radio, he said everyone had an inalienable right to understand events both in the outside world and closer to home. He said that whether or not their fears were justified, those concerned with scientific progress must take them into account. Mr. Shuros said this was just as important when dealing with the effects of a military nuclear test as it was with a regretful catastrophe at a nuclear power plant. Political observers see his remarks as indirect criticism of the Soviet Union for failing to give even their East European neighbors detailed and accurate information about the Chernobyl disaster at the time it was most needed. Only 2 days ago, Hungarian television's correspondent in Moscow spoke of the difficulty about getting proper details. He said he'd been trying in vain all day.
The government has not yet released today's official bulletin on the effects of the Chernobyl accident in Britain, but our science correspondent understands that levels of radioactivity are falling slowly in the air, on the ground, and in fresh foods as the remains of the Chernobyl cloud continue to disperse and break up. Scientists are still emphasizing that people do not need to take precautions except to avoid drinking large amounts of rainwater. During Prime Minister's question time in the Commons, the Labour leader, Mr. Neil Kinnock, spoke of a widespread feeling that there was insufficient coordination between government departments over the release of information about the Chernobyl accident. He also urged Mrs. Thatcher to ensure that when such information was released, it was put in a form the public could understand clearly. The Prime Minister said she sympathized with this point, and that was why a special information room had been set up at the Department of the Environment. In response to another question, Mrs. Thatcher said the safety record of the nuclear power industry in Britain had been excellent. She believed that record would continue, and as a result, the industry would regain public confidence. The European Commission in Brussels has banned, with immediate effect, import of fresh meat and live animals from the areas of Eastern Europe most affected by the Chernobyl disaster. The ban relates to the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland and Yugoslavia. Other proposals to ban imports of other fresh foods need the approval of the 12 EEC governments. Senior diplomats finished drawing up the list of products only late last night, and the deadline for consideration was extended from 5 o'clock this afternoon until tomorrow lunchtime. A ban would take effect from Saturday.